Thank you all for being here today. Many of you I know, but for those of you whom I don't know, my name is Penny Wright, and I'm in charge of adult programs here at the library, and we're delighted to all be here with you and with our guest, James Barron. Before I introduce him, I want to let you know that we have many programs going on here at the library, and we invite you after today's talk to peruse through our newsletter, and we also have flyers on the table and out in the hall, and we'd love to have you at all of our events. Today is a day we've talked about for quite some time now, and that is that James Barron is here to talk about his book, The 1 Cent Magenta. He has been here at least twice, and perhaps 3 times. We were trying to reconstruct once he came to talk about his wonderful book about Steinway piano. Was that called The Piano? And another time he was here to talk about a book he compiled about New York. And he possibly came to talk about the New York Times, we're not sure. But in any case, in the future, we do hope to have him back to talk about the New York Times. But that won't be for a little while. Anyway, James has been a reporter for the New York Times for 40 years, which I've just learned, and that was a very impressive number. He wrote the minute-by-minute stories on the 9/11 attacks in 2001 for NewYorkTimes.com, and the front page lead stories on the Northeast blackout in 2003, on Hurricane Irene in 2010, and Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and on the elementary school shootings in Sandy Hook, Connecticut in that same year. For 25 years, he has also prepared an audio version of the next morning's front page, first for WQXR FM in New York, and later for NewYorkTimes.com, which distributed it as a podcast. So he is the author of Piano, and if you haven't read that, it's a fascinating book, The Making of the Steinway Concert Grand. And he also edited the book about New York City. James Barron and his wife, Jane Farhi, live in the Northwest Woods section of East Hampton, and we're delighted to have her with us today. She's a cardiologist, and she's taken a day off. I think they're here on vacation, so it's lovely to have them both. Please welcome James Barron.
Well, thank you, Penny. It's good to be here. This is vacation, but it's fun, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm glad you've taken time from your day when you could be at the beach or out in the sun to be here with us. So yes, I wrote a book about a 1-cent stamp, but not any of those. It's not a U.S. stamp, it's a stamp from British Guiana, but it's not any of those either. The one on the left there is almost the right color, but the book is about a stamp that's a little bit older, that one. Now I know, you don't fall in love with this stamp for its looks, but stamp collectors call it the Mona Lisa of stamps. It's not much wider than 1 key on a piano, and it would take 541 of those little stamps to cover the actual Mona Lisa. And since we've got a picture of a grand piano up there, it would take something like 5,669 stamps to cover a grand piano. The 1 cent magenta is the world's most valuable object by size and weight. It sold for $9.5 million the last time it changed hands. So this book is the story of that stamp and its 9 owners, or 10 if you count the government of France, which claimed it for a while after World War I. The current owner, who paid the $9.5 million, learned about the 1 cent magenta from a Donald Duck comic book when he was a teenager in the 1950s. Just think about how relatively inexpensive the stamp was back then. It sounds like a bargain. If you account for inflation, that's only about $460,000 now. The 1-cent Magenta was not supposed to be so special. It was an improvisation, a quick and dirty solution in a 19th century British colony that usually sold stamps printed in London. But in late 1855, the local postmaster in British Guiana was worried his supply was running low, and so he had provisional stamps printed right there in British Guiana. Somebody clipped off the corners, and in the 1990s, the editor of American Philatelist magazine called it the ugliest stamp he'd ever seen. Unlike the famous inverted Jenny, the 1-cent Magenta is not just rare, it's unique. The inverted Jenny is the 1918 stamp that was mistakenly printed with the biplane upside down. There are 100 inverted Jennies. There's only one 1-cent Magenta. For most of its life, the 1-cent Magenta remained safely out of sight, locked in bank vaults or on a shelf in a palace in Europe. The owners had their pet names for the 1-cent Magenta. One called it the Magenta Lady. That was the previous owner, John E. DuPont, who, besides being an heir to the DuPont chemical fortune, was a collector's collector. Long before he bought the 1-cent Magenta, he amassed 60 million shells and 2 million birds. That's enough to start a museum, and he did in Delaware. He also owned thousands of stamps, and he used a huge library in his mansion in Pennsylvania as his workroom. Once when he went to a stamp show and got back kind of late and the night clerk at the hotel couldn't open the safe, he slept with the 1-cent Magenta under his pillow. He even paid a broker who dealt in such things to put his picture on a stamp from Redonda. That's a micronation. It's so small, it's circled there in the lower left. Very small circle in the Caribbean. It's uninhabited. It's about 30 miles from Antigua. It was named by Christopher Columbus in 1493, and it was later mined for fertilizer. Intriguing as they were, all of those details about Johnny DuPont were largely forgotten when he died in 2010. Most of the obituaries about him began by saying he'd shot an Olympic gold medal wrestler who lived and trained on DuPont's estate in Pennsylvania. He was convicted in 1997 and sentenced to 30 years in prison. The obituaries did not say that 2 hours before the shooting, he was in a stamp store shopping. I talked to the clerk who waited on him, who assumed when he heard on the radio that there was trouble at DuPont's estate, he assumed DuPont was the victim, not the gunman. Now, before DuPont, the 1-cent Magenta was owned by 8 partners from Pennsylvania. The leader traveled with the stamp in a briefcase he handcuffed to his wrist. Sometimes he went places in an armored car like that one. It was a stunt. The only problem was, in Toronto once, the key to the handcuffs, it broke off. Before him, the owner was an upholstery manufacturer with what I guess you'd call wife trouble. She deprived him of his final wish, which was to deprive her of the 1-cent Magenta. That was Arthur Hine. He's the one in the center there. He bought the 1-cent Magenta in 1922 for the record-breaking price of $32,500. Don't you think he looks a little like Daddy Warbucks? Kind of down market maybe, and look at this. One leg of his trousers is noticeably shorter than the other. Apparently that was one of Arthur Hine's trademarks. He had his pants made that way, I guess because he could. He never said why. Now, Daddy Warbucks, according to no less an authority than Little Orphan Annie, had $10 zillion. Hine, according to no less an authority than Arthur Hine himself, had a pile of cash, at least $7 million, and he bought thousands and thousands of stamps, so many he couldn't keep track of them all. That was before the Depression knocked his net worth down to a mere million or so. The inventory of his stamp holdings ran to hundreds of pages. It was as thick as a telephone book. I know this I paid a lawyer in Utica to get it Xeroxed at the courthouse, where it was filed with his will when he died. It's in a room upstairs in our house right now. It is every bit as thick as the Manhattan phone book used to be. But you do have to wonder about Utica, where Arthur Hine lived. The newspaper up there didn't exactly tell it like it was. When the stock market crashed, it made headlines. It made headlines in Brooklyn, in Illinois, and on the Great White Way, and in La La Land, thanks to Variety. Even the New York Times, which can be rather wordy on days when I take off, said the stock market collapsed. Not the newspapers in Utica. An economic disaster was a sales record, and the sun will come out tomorrow. Now, when Hine died, his widow married the monument salesman who went by to sell her the headstone for Hine's grave. She got the stamp because Hine was kind of disorganized. The will said she was supposed to get their house, their 2 cars, which were Packards, and the contents of the house. Hine died thinking he'd sent the 1-cent Magenta off to the bank where he had moved all of his stamps. But no, somehow it came back to the house from a stamp show. They sent the world's most valuable stamp by regular mail in those days. It came back to the house, and somehow Hine never got it to the bank. So the probate judge said she could have the stamp, a little Magenta meal ticket. These days we have people who are famous for being famous. Well, Arthur Hine was famous for owning the 1-cent Magenta, and in 1923 he was invited to speak at the Collectors Club in New York. That's a group of VIPs in stamp world, and as it happens, one of the people was there that night who figured in my first book. As Penny said, that was about watching Steinway & Sons build one piano from start to finish out at their factory near LaGuardia Airport. Well, from 1927 to 1955, Steinway & Sons was run by a world-class stamp collector. Theodore E. Steinway was a grandson of one of the sons in Steinway & Sons, and he was so well thought of in stamp world that when tiny little Liechtenstein issued a series of stamps commemorating important philatelists, he was one of them. Theodore E. Steinway collected what are called bullseye stamps, or socked on the nose stamps. These are stamps with postmarks that hit the exact center. And here's the thing about Theodore E. Steinway. His middle name honors a man who was a friend and neighbor of his parents, the actor Edwin Booth, who was widely considered the greatest, America's greatest Shakespearean actor, at least at the end of the 19th century. And he was the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who shot Abraham Lincoln. There are Edwin Booth and John Wilkes Booth with their younger brother Junius in a production of all things of Julius Caesar, the year before the Lincoln assassination. As you might expect, Theodore Steinway also specialized in stamps that had to do with pianos and pianists. There's a stamp from Theodore E.'s collection signed by the great Polish pianist Paderewski. Steinway & Sons even referred to postage in one of its ads. This was in 1936. I do wonder if this was the ad agency playing up to the boss. As you can see there, they figured out that if you mailed a piano, the postage would be $216.98. They also figured out that delivering it themselves in their own Steinway truck was cheaper, at least in the New York area. It's true, people have mailed pianos. Members of Parliament did it in Britain in the 19th century. But the idea of mailing a brand new piano reminded me of the man who mailed himself. That was W. Reginald Bray. He actually did it not once, but twice. That time it took 2 postmen to deliver him.
No.
Before that, when he was younger, he splurged and sent himself by registered mail. Bicycle messenger was assigned to deliver him. His house wasn't far from the post office, And the messenger exacted revenge. I mean, they knew Bray at the post office. So the messenger walked to Bray's house after putting Bray on the bicycle and telling him to start pedaling. That's Bray's father there in the doorway signing the receipt and taking delivery, because it's the post office, there has to be a receipt. So the year after Steinway ran that ad about mailing the piano, or not, Theodore E. Steinway tackled a project to build a piano that was definitely not mailed. The project was to build a piano for the White House, replacing that one, which by then was more than 30 years old. But first, the president of Steinway had to get the design approved by no less than the President of the United States. So Theodore E. and his son John went off to see FDR. They packed 2 big suitcases containing a couple of scale models of possible pianos. The president chose one, and then he and Steinway talked about what they really wanted to talk about, which was stamps, because in those days the U.S. had a philatelist-in-chief. FDR was a passionate stamp collector. He sketched out designs for stamps and sent them to the Postmaster General. And when he went to the big conferences in World War II, to Potsdam and Yalta, the heaviest item in his luggage sometimes was his stamp album. The Steinways went back to the factory and built the White House piano, the new one. It's some piano. They even got it patented. The legs look like eagles and there's real gold leaf on them. They delivered it in a ceremony in 1938. Theodore E. Steinway spoke, and he said they were grateful as immigrants who'd been welcomed in the U.S. and allowed to do what they did. Theodore E. Steinway figured in 2 moments in the 1-cent Magenta book. One was in 1947, when he was the chairman of the World Stamp Show held in New York City. It celebrated 100 years of postage stamps in the United States. The 1-cent Magenta was there, except when it wasn't. It disappeared. It had its own special case, and someone noticed it wasn't inside. Well, they called in detectives who issued all-points bulletins for a missing stamp, and they wondered which Stamp World Houdini had made off with it while the room was full and everybody was there. But nobody had stolen what was, even then, the world's most expensive stamp. It had simply slipped off its mooring in the little case and gone on a short trip, drifting for a moment before coming to rest on the bottom of the case. Someone finally looked down there and noticed, oh, it's there, everything's fine. They put it back, and the stamp show went on. The other moment about Theodore E. Steinway and the 1-cent Magenta takes us back to Arthur Hind. This was the night in 1923 when Hind appeared at the Collectors Club. I'm sure he was pleased that the event broke the club's attendance records, but I wouldn't call it a talk. Hind said not one word. He was introduced after a very nice dinner, but his lips were sealed. You can't make this up, and in case you think I'm trying, there's what the Collectors Club magazine, what their own magazine said about it. Hard-headed Arthur Hind was intimidated by all those learned stamp people. So all he did was take 3 albums out of a satchel. Hind was famous for owning the 1-cent Magenta, but he was infamous for the way he put his stamps in his albums, the way he attached them. Some he glued, some he affixed with little bandages. As you can see, he taped that famous Boscawen cover at the left and the right. Stamp people just don't do that. It's like tampering with a historical document almost. And the Collectors Club magazine summed up Hind's presentation, shall we say, diplomatically. Now, we don't know what Hind knew about how the 1-cent Magenta was made, meaning how it was printed or who cut the corners off. So we don't know if he knew that the 1-cent Magenta exists because sometimes your ship doesn't come in. If you're the postmaster in British Guiana and an order of 100,000 stamps from London isn't on the ship it was supposed to be on, you get worried about running out of stamps. And you go to the local newspaper and say, maybe not in these words, help. Well, the newspaper set the type and printed a batch of stamps. These photographs are from the South Street Seaport Museum in New York, which has a print shop downtown with equipment of about the same age, not that different from what they had in British Guiana. South Street even had a little image of a ship that was close to the one they used in the stamp in the 1850s. And pretty soon, on the afternoon I went there, we were printing stamps. There's the result. Now, I thought about turning the ship upside down. Because you have no idea how, when you tell people you're writing a book about a stamp, the world's most expensive stamp, you have no idea how they say, oh, you mean the one with the upside down airplane you saw earlier? Well, no. I also thought about changing one letter in the Latin motto. This would have replicated a famous mistake on an earlier batch of provisional stamps printed in the same place in the same way. What happened was the word penimus, which makes it say we give and ask in return, was misspelled as patimus, which means we suffer in return. Patimus might be closer to how the postmaster felt by the time this was all done. But there's more to the 1 cent magenta than just the printing. There's the postmark. Like the printing itself, it's kind of uneven. You can't see the 6 in the 1856. And before the stamp was postmarked, it was initialed there on the left. The postmaster, whose name was Dalton, made the clerks do that for fraud protection. Even then, they worried about counterfeiting. There were other printing presses in British Guiana. The sugar plantations had them to make labels for the bags of sugar that they sent off to their dealers. So Postmaster Dalton was worried somebody could conceivably make up a fake stamp. And that's why Postal Clerk E.T. Dwight took a pen and became the John Hancock of the 1 cent magenta. Now, no one knows what happened to the stamp for the next 16 years. It was printed, sold, and forgotten until 1873, when a 12-year-old boy found it among some papers in his uncle's house. Louis Vernon Vaughan was caught up in what was then the hot new fad of stamp collecting. He didn't think much of the 1 cent magenta. Late in life, he said he always thought he'd find a better one. He'd gotten a batch of more attractive stamps from a dealer in England on approval, which meant he had to pay for them or send them back. Now, every stamp collector has dreamed of finding that one precious stamp someday. Little Louis Vaughan had it right there in his hand, but he didn't know that. So he sold the 1 cent magenta for 6 shillings, or not quite $17 now. One philatelic writer called it the worst stamp deal in history. The buyer was a man named Neil Ross McKinnon, who kept it for a while, but then in 1878, through intermediaries, he sold it to that man, Ferrari, an eccentric aristocrat who assembled an unparalleled collection of stamps and who lived there in the Hotel Matignon. It's now the official residence of the French Prime Minister. And it's guarded by very polite gendarmes who don't really want their pictures taken if you happen to walk by with a camera around your neck when the gate swings open, as I did. But the story everybody remembers about the 1 cent magenta came later. It's another Arthur Hines story, so we'll fast forward past 1922, after Ferrari died and the French government sold the stamp and Hines bought it, and past 1933, when Hines died and his wife went to court to get the stamp, because this story begins in 1938 with a letter to the editor of a stamp magazine. The letter writer said he'd been a cabin boy on a steamship that sailed in and out of British Guiana. He said he bought a packet of old letters from the relative of a drinking buddy there. He didn't think much about the stamps on the letters until he read about Hind and the famous 1 cent magenta, and he realized he had one just like it, which for our purposes here we're showing in black and white. Well, the sailor described going to Utica, where Hind lived, and showing his stamp to Hind, and Hind reaching into his safe and taking out his stamp. The sailor said they looked exactly alike. Hines said he would buy the sailor's stamp if the sailor came back the next day. Not even Arthur Hine kept that much cash lying around the house. So the sailor went back, and after Hine paid him, Hine jovially took out 2 cigars. Hine put his in his mouth and puffed on it. Hine smoked cigars. They were stogies. They weren't from Cuba. And then Hine did the one thing the sailor didn't see coming. Hine took the match and touched it to the second stamp, the one he just bought from the sailor, who was horrified. And as it burned, Hine said, "Now there's only one 1-cent Magenta." And if you like the graphics here, wait until about slide 90. So what if the story's too good to be true? There's really no way to know, but the image that it creates in your mind is unforgettable. Also, it presented Hine as Stamp World saw him. They didn't like that he bought his way in. Hine must have known this. He himself told a story that originated with a British clergyman who imagined the dialogue between Hine and St. Peter at the gate of heaven. Hine arrived, and St. Peter asked, "Have you fed the poor, or visited the sick, or done good works?" And Hine said, "No, I really didn't have time, but I have a 1-cent stamp from British Guiana that I paid $32,500 for. Even His Majesty the King of England personally congratulated me when I acquired. Would you like to see it?" Peter slammed the gate shut. That wasn't the response Hine was expecting, and on the subject of responses other people weren't expecting, there was a night on Jeopardy in 2015 when Alex Trebek didn't get the response he was expecting. I'd say this shows 2 things. One is the stamp had worked its way into the national consciousness, the national conversation. Also that we haven't got the right font on our computer here. But the thing was, none of the contestants on Jeopardy rang in and got the right answer, which was John E. DuPont, whom we saw earlier. DuPont bought the 1-cent Magenta in 1980, but at first he didn't want it known. He sent it off to one stamp show and listed the owner's name as Ray Mader, which was an anagram of Demerara, the province along the coast there in British Guiana where the stamp was printed. Now, DuPont had a thing for guns, and as his descent into mental illness deepened in the 1990s, he fired one at the ceiling while changing a light bulb. He also believed his estate was filled with mechanical trees, and he was convinced the trees moved around on electronic commands from remote controllers he couldn't see. Neither could anyone else. That was slide 90. DuPont could just as easily appear normal, even charming. There was no telling which he would be, the sane DuPont or the insane DuPont. Shopping at that stamp store, DuPont couldn't have been more normal. That was on a Friday afternoon. DuPont told the sales clerk he'd be back on Monday to pick up yet another stamp album. He shot Dave Schultz less than 2 hours later. And he never saw the 1-cent Magenta again, except perhaps on television while he was in prison. A cable TV show did a segment on DuPont and the stamp, and for a few days, DuPont's cell block was buzzing about the famous prisoner with the famous stamp. DuPont's lawyer told me DuPont enjoyed the attention. The film Foxcatcher was less flattering. It's mostly about DuPont's fascination with athletics and his deranged behavior, and of course, the murder. But people in Stamp World had a problem with the one scene that refers to DuPont's stamps. And there's a helicopter and there's some cocaine, and DuPont is trying to get Dave Schultz's brother Mark to rehearse a speech DuPont wrote for the event they're going to. Schultz is supposed to introduce DuPont. The speech calls for Schultz to run through DuPont's accomplishments: ornithologist, author, world explorer, philatelist. But Schultz can't say the words. He gets the first one barely. He says ornithologist. The last one stops him completely. DuPont has to teach him how to say it, and it's an amusing little rhythmical game. If watching an actor teach someone else how to say something, and in effect a little rehearsal. In stamp world, though, the problem was not the cocaine and not the helicopter, but the long A. Steve Carell, the actor who played DuPont, pronounced it flightly, which is not how the world has been pronouncing that word according to every dictionary since Webster's Supplement of New Words in 1980. It's always been pronounced with a short A that rhymes with cat, flattest. After all that, you're probably wondering what happened at that auction with the $9.5 million. This was the stamp's moment in the spotlight. Literally, the auctioneer showed it off in that special little case they had made for it, and people gawked at it. They marveled how something so small could be worth so much money. And they marveled at the white glove treatment that it got. The bidding took only 2 or 3 minutes, and the bidder was not identified. Sotheby's said he wanted to remain anonymous, so the mystery continued. I put out feelers trying to find out who it was, and finally one day the phone rang. I wasn't there, but thankfully the voicemail system did what it's supposed to do, and a man with a very deep voice left his number. I called back and he said his name. Oh, wait a minute. Is anybody here wearing Stuart Weitzman's shoes? Because that's who bought the 1-cent Magenta. A lot of shoes helped pay for that stamp. Stuart Weitzman is a collector, but he's not really a stamp collector. He collects one-of-a-kind things. One such thing that he dotes on is a pair of shoes, women's shoes appropriately enough, that were autographed by the 1941 New York Yankees. He didn't want the 1-cent Magenta hidden away in a vault. He wanted people to see it, and he personally didn't want to have the 1-cent Magenta in his possession, so he lent it to the National Postal Museum, which now occupies that grand old post office in Washington next to Union Station. So it's on display there, so if you can get out of Penn Station in New York this summer, when you get off the train in Washington, all you have to do is cross a short little street and go in, and you can see the 1-cent Magenta. They have high-tech devices there for looking at low-tech stamps. The 1-cent Magenta is on display behind thick glass that's supposed to block light that could make the stamp fade more than it already has. So that's where it is, that's what it is. There's more about the 1-cent Magenta in the book. I hope you'll read it and enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Would you take some questions?
Sure. Anybody have questions?
Why were the edges clipped off?
We don't know. No one knows who did it or why they did it. We know things like Ferrari liked to have the stamps he owned cut the corners off of them. So maybe he did it. Maybe the 12-year-old did it to get it off of the newspaper. We don't know. I mean, there are mysteries here, and that's one of them that remains unsolved and probably always will.
What piqued your interest?
I went to the auction. This is the beginning of the book. So
What's the question?
the question was what piqued my interest. I guess this is sort of need-to-know basis here. If you need to know, you need to read the book, because you don't have to read past about the first 5 or 6 pages to get this. I went to a cocktail party, and the only person I recognized was the auctioneer. I had written about him before. He'd sold the Declaration of Independence twice, the same copy twice. He sold the Magna Carta. He sold one of the pianos from Casablanca. There were 2. I go into this in the book. The second one has also since been sold. Well, you know, when there aren't very many people there at the beginning of a party, when you get there a little early and there's only one person that you know, you go over to him, and essentially what I said to him is, "What have you done for me lately?" Now, what I said was, "What are you up to?" Because this is a guy who always had something interesting going on, and he said, "I'm going to sell what will be the world's most expensive stamp in a few weeks." And then he started talking about going to London to get it authenticated, and maybe there's a problem there with people who would want to dip it in benzene, which it turned out they didn't. But by then I was hooked. I thought this would at least be a good story, and it turned into a book.
How does a stamp in a small little country become a rare stamp for that?
The question was, how does a stamp from a small little, well, British province really, become so rare? That has to do with supply and demand, and I guess with provenance. In other words, when that stamp got out of British Guiana in 1878, that made its reputation, because the person who bought it, Ferrari, was anything in his collection was suddenly worth more for having been in his collection, for having had his imprimatur on it. That was a part of it. By then it had also been blessed by two of the founding fathers, I guess, of philately, who said it was what we think it is. In other words, here was this stamp. How did you know it wasn't a total forgery? It had been forgotten, as I said, printed and sold, and that was that. The two experts on, these two big experts looked at it and said, it's the real thing. There's an issue of stamps that we didn't know about, and that got it into the catalog. And then also, there hasn't been any other. There are other stamps of which there's only one, but this one vaulted to the top through that combination of circumstances. It's the only stamp from the good old, the grand old days when the sun never set on the British Empire. Every stamp from all the colonies, from London itself, were supposed to go into the Queen's collection, which is in St. James's Palace. I went there and met with the keeper of the stamp collection, who it turns out is a big fan, thanks to satellite television. He's a big fan of the St. Louis Cardinals. Who knew? Also of Friends. This is the only stamp from the days when the sun never set that's not there in that vault. So, yes.
Curious, does anybody know how many were printed?
The best guess is about 500. The question was, does anybody know how many stamps were printed? The answer to that is no. The best guess, as I say, is maybe around 500. Probably 40 a page, so not very many. After all, they didn't need them for long. It took several months for ships to go back and forth, but the postmaster was probably thinking far enough ahead when he ordered these up that he wasn't out of them yet. If they were printed in late January of that year, this one was postmarked, as we saw, in April. So he was thinking far ahead, and presumably another batch of stamps came in before he actually really did run out. Someone else?
Where is it now that one can see it?
At the National Postal Museum, which is run by the Smithsonian. It's right next to Union Station in Washington. It used to be the post office. I grew up in Washington, and I can remember when that was the post office. It's a big, wonderful building like the main post office on 8th Avenue in New York City.
How long did it take you to write this book?
On and off about 2.5 years, maybe.
A lot of research.
Well, yeah, you know, and you try to do what you can, and there's probably always something that you're not going to know in a mystery like this, like who cut the corners off. I mean, you get as far along as you can, and there's nowhere practical, there's no farther practical way you can go on that. That sentence didn't come out very well. There's not much farther you can go, period. Anybody else?
What's the state of stamp collecting now? I mean, we're familiar with what it used to be. What is it now?
I don't think it's what it was. I'll have a better sense in a month, because in early August I'm supposed to go to the American Philatelic Society's convention in Richmond. And that's one of the things that I want to look around and see. My sense is kids aren't doing this today the way they did when I was a child. I mean, I collected stamps for a couple of years, not very seriously. But I don't think that's in the mix the way it was. Stamps aren't in the mix the way they were. You can pay bills electronically now, you don't need stamps. Your father's not always running to the post office when he realizes there's some bill he forgot to mail 2 days ago, which was sometimes the story in our house. We knew where every post office was. He even figured out that my college application had to be postmarked on December 31st, which, as I recall, was a Friday. So there was going to be a weekend and the New Year's holiday. He was so worried that if it was not postmarked, I wouldn't get in, that I wrote the application, the essay on the application that afternoon, and he practically got onto the runway at National Airport. Well, not really, but there was a post office at National Airport, and that had the last postmark of the day in the entire Washington area. And that's where we took it. And, you know, I got into college and here I am. And one of my roommates didn't send his in until like January 10th. So, you know.
Two questions. Does Stuart Weitzman still own that stamp?
The question was, does Stuart Weitzman still own the stamp? Yes, he has, whatever the past tense of the verb is, it's on loan to the museum.
And the other question, was this part of, do they have plate blocks in those years?
And the question is, did they have plate blocks? A plate block is like the four images of the four stamps of the inverted Jenny that we showed. On a page of stamps, there's a place where the numbers are from the printing press. Well, in this case, it didn't matter because it was such an improvisation. In other words, if it had been coming from London, engraved, conceivably there would have been. In this case, probably not. They weren't numbered. It was probably one sheet of paper that was being reinserted in the press in different positions. So.
I have, yes, now, this stamp that is on loan, suppose somebody wants to purchase it, who do they go, well, I guess they
Go to, the question is, if somebody, if you have your $9.5 million ready, which is probably more than that, because, you know, adjust for inflation since 2014, if you have your $9.5 million and you really want this stamp, well, I think there you have to call. The question was, what do you do? And I think you have to talk to Mr. Weitzman, who has said he doesn't really want to sell it. He wants it to be seen. But I think his thinking is it should be in a museum and even if on loan like this and seen.
If you were selling a large stamp collection, how would you go about selling it?
Find a stamp dealer and see what they think, what valuation they put on it, and maybe as with if you need a second opinion on something else, find a second one too. And if you're more comfortable with one than the other, that might decide it.
There was a movie with Audrey Hepburn and Cary Grant.
Yes, 1963, Charade.
Charade, that,
Yes.
and where did they hide the money? It was on the stamp. Was that the Magenta? It wasn't the Magenta.
No, although it sounded an awful lot like it.
Yeah.
And there was an earlier movie, this is described in the book. There was a potboiler from RKO that also sounded like the one set Magenta and was around the time it had changed hands. But maybe they were, maybe they were just alluding to something they figured the audience would vaguely remember. All right, thank you very much.
James Barron, thank you so much for a really interesting talk. And we do hope to get you back, to talk about other matters, but that will come in due time. In the meantime, thank you all for coming. We really enjoyed your talk and your